Welcome back to another episode of In the Dugout, a new online discussion forum by the Rhode Island Center for Freedom and Prosperity on issues of importance to Rhode Islanders and to Rhode Island businesses. I'm Mike Stenhouse, and I'll be your host. Format of In the Dugout is pretty simple. It's like a couple of guys, sometimes a couple of gals, are sitting around in the dugout like I used to do when I played pro ball, just talking about issues that are important to us. And so today I'm joined by two of my teammates, I can say, with good longtime friends, and welcome Jonathan Williams and Justin Katz. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Jonathan Williams is the chief economist and vice president for the Center of State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council, otherwise known as ALEC, where he works with state policymakers all the time. And he's the co-author of the book Rich States, Poor States, which is a competitive index. Unfortunately, Rhode Island doesn't usually do too well on there. He does that with Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore. Justin Katz, many of you know, is our center's research director. He's also the editor of the Ocean State Current, our online journalism and blog site. And he's co-author of the report, The Decision of a Century, which we're about to discuss today. So before we get into business, you know our tradition. We don our baseball cap. So knowing what Jonathan is going to wear, I'm going to put on my Montreal Expos cap, the first major league team I played for, because Jonathan, the Montreal Expos are now who?
The World Series champion Washington Nationals.
That's right. So, there's some of my lineage in your World Championship. You live in D.C., right? So I know you're a Tigers fan originally, but you've become a Nats fan.
They're my National League team, and my Tigers, as you can see, Comerica Park behind me here, are my American League team. And my Michigan roots, of course, will always be there. But here I am in the land of make-believe, as I like to call it now, in Washington, D.C. And so we're glad to have a World Series ring.
We call Rhode Island the progressive land of make-believe as well. Justin, can you beat that? You've got 2 World Series caps here. What do you got, Justin?
I've got a bunch, I think. I've got my vintage anchorrising.com hat from trying to turn Rhode Island red from years ago. All my other baseball caps were destroyed when I was a carpenter and wore them nonstop. Growing up in New Jersey too, all my caps are also put me in danger if I wear them around here.
No, you can wear them around here. But I'm glad you brought that up, Joe, because even probably most of our supporters don't know, and I doubt Jonathan does, but Justin was one of the first conservative bloggers on the whole internet in the whole country. He was certainly the first one in Rhode Island. But back when, in the very early nascence of the internet, Justin was one of the first ones out there, and it was Anchor Rising, and it was certainly one of my favorite moves I made upon starting the center was to bring Anchor Rising on board, and we now call it Anchor Rising in the Ocean State Current. So, all right, let's get into business right now. The decision of a century is what we're calling it. We'll talk soon. Every state is facing some kind of revenue loss because of the shutdowns and the COVID-19 crisis. In Rhode Island, it's always especially severe. We're always the first in, last out recessions, usually the hardest hit. And so we put out a paper, much of which was premised around some of the principles put forth by Jonathan Williams and his organization, ALEC. And it's a budget strategy, how lawmakers can deal with the uncertainties of a recovery and revenues moving forward. So first question, let's just talk about actual budget deficits. Justin, in summary, what is Rhode Island looking at?
Well, at the moment, we're edging up toward $1 billion of budgetary shortfall, according to state government experts. 900 million. We're getting up there. It reminds me of about 15 years ago when some of us were just getting started and there was a budget crisis and everybody thought it might hit $1 billion. We very well might hit $1 billion. In our report, Dennis Sheehan did some analysis for us and he puts the top end at 1.6 billion over 2 years, possibly missing. So wow. It's a real big chunk in about a $10 billion budget.
All right, so 10% of overall budget, and probably most of that is loss of local money, so it could be as high as 20-30% of local revenues. Would that be right?
Right, and that's why they're all the politicians are hanging their hats, so to speak,
Yeah,
on a
we'll
federal
get to that.
bailout.
All right, Jonathan, what are you seeing throughout states throughout the country? That's your job, is to talk to state lawmakers.
Yeah, so as we talk with our 2,000 or so state lawmakers at ALEC and a lot of the other executives that we work with in the governor's offices, I mean, the numbers are horrible, as you might expect in a lot of states. And we've been through lots of recessions before. This one's different, of course, as you guys know, in that it was really the kind of the forced government suppression of the economy, and some of that is a trade-off for the health concerns clearly, and some of it was justified, but some of it probably went way too far. And some states are still not really reopening in a full way, while others are leading the way. So you get this kind of effect where many states are going to recover more quickly than others because of their health concerns and how quickly their states have opened up their communities and their economies. But then you also, Mike, as you know, following the markets, seen the complete collapse of oil and gas prices over the last few months. And so some of the states in the oil patch, such as Oklahoma and Alaska and North Dakota, are going to have very acute budget issues because they, in many cases, base a good chunk of their spending on the price of oil as well. So you have that additional consideration going on with the overall economic downturn.
Wow. Okay. So it's varying. Justin just said maybe 25% of general revenues. Where would you could you put that in national perspective? Where that
Yeah.
would?
So some of the estimates I've seen from different groups say that it could be anywhere between 200 and 250 billion in shortfalls based
Total.
on the revenue. Yeah, right, across the 50 states. And obviously that's not going to be uniform. So some states are going to see closer to 30% downturn in revenue. Other states are going to be probably closer to 10% or some even less, just all depending on the fundamentals of their economy and how quickly their economy was able to get restarted post-COVID.
All right, so that's a great segue. So let's bring up our first slide, which is just a little screenshot of the executive summary of the report, the decision of the century. And again, we say that because you can see in the highlighted yellow area that we really believe that how our state, because of the massive deficit, are we going to try to tax our way out of it? Are we going to try to grow our way out of it? Are we going to try to kick the can down the road and borrow? How lawmakers decide how to handle this massive deficit in our state will probably set the trajectory for our state for years, if not decades to come. Thus the budget of the decision of the century. And the three core strategies we're recommending: really understanding and publicizing what the core principles of government are, from which sets a guideline. I'm going to have Justin talk about revenue constrained spending in just a second, which I think is a great concept. Basically, you spend the money you get. And then not knowing how quickly we recover, setting priority budgeting targets. So that depending on how much money comes in, you know which programs you're going to spend on first. So Justin, tell us a little bit about your concept of a revenue constrained spending philosophy.
Well, the idea is they're going to have to find some way to narrow down their spending. They've got to have some way to do that. And the way we've usually done it in Rhode Island is the leadership of the House and then the governor and the Senate. They decide what they want, and then the rest is kind of who has political power. And you see this across the board. A great example is when we actually saw an increase in our local school choice tax credit scholarships. That's because the interests there were able to have enough power to get another $500 in the budget. That's how we usually do it, who has political power. And the way we kind of think it ought to be done is you take what you have. Leadership is about going out and saying, here's what we'll do if we have to, not trying to avoid the decisions, as we've seen with our General Assembly hiding under its desk for the past 3 months now. And so you start with an estimate, 3 different estimates we're calling for, of how much revenue you're actually going to get. And then you put out some principles about how as the money comes in, you're going to decide what gets funded and what doesn't. And we basically put that through 2 different filters. One of them.
We'll get into the filters shortly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Jonathan, so I want you to comment on that revenue constrained spending concept, A, and then also comment on the ALEC budget toolkit that you put together, which is meant to be a strategic guide for lawmakers, and then also some of the ideas from your toolkit we did use in here were also adopted by another blue state all the way across the country, Washington State. So talk about both of those, revenue constrained spending and how Washington State helped itself.
Yeah, well, the revenue constrained spending is really a must when it comes to states that need to balance budgets and have to live within their means. And of course, for those states that want to remain competitive, you alluded to this in your report, and that Rhode Island clearly is failing in that regard to being economically competitive, and having this choice right now as to raising taxes in the face of this COVID crisis is exactly the wrong direction. So it really leaves you with the budget prioritization model and keeping it within revenue constraints. And I think that's key. In Washington State, under a Democrat governor, Gary Locke, who then went on to serve in the Obama administration, if you remember, as Secretary of Commerce, and a bipartisan group of legislators made that determination themselves in blue Washington by saying the economy is too weak to raise taxes. So then you're forced into this prioritizing government, just like any small business or family would. It's really just kitchen table budgeting, Mike. And it's something that government often just overlooks because they think there's always this extra revenue they can extract out of the private sector from some big company or some individual they think is the cash cow that's going to cause the solution to all government spending needs. But at the end of the day, at this point, I think the COVID crisis in a way has shaken that core concept of big government to say, well, wait a minute, we cannot go back to the private sector right now, or these businesses, many of those, are not going to reopen their doors unless we figure out a better way to go about budgeting.
Well, I'll tell you that that might be the case around a lot of the country, but around here, the very influential progressive left is calling for new taxes on businesses and new taxes on the wealthy, of course, and of course, you and I and Justin all believe that's like you said, the very worst thing you can do right now. The only way to grow back the economy is to grow the economy. And you don't do that by choking it with more taxes. Justin, you had mentioned just a few minutes ago in your remarks a filter. So take a minute or two, if we can bring up the slide of the filter and explain how you see the money filtering down into necessary programs versus unnecessary programs.
Well, that's what as we discussed how to conceive of this idea. This is what came to mind. So you start with the spigot. This is for estimating. You, as I said earlier, you start with 3 or however many scenarios you want of what revenue might look like in the long term, and then you have to put forward your ways, the ways you're going to just narrow that down. So the first one we call the priority filter, and that's really the big way you're going to get big chunks of your budget that you can put in your different categories. So you're ranging from things you legally have to pay for, you're obligated to pay for them, you have no choice, all the way to things you shouldn't be paying for anyway. The famous fraud and abuse. And then there are nice to have things, and then in the middle there are things government would have a hard time getting itself out of. For example, a big part of every government budget is education. There are people who believe that government maybe shouldn't be funding that, but even if you wanted to do that, it would be very, very hard morally and politically to make that happen. So there's that sort of a middle bucket. So that's priorities. And once you've got that, you've got most of your budget kind of drawn out, and you've got to make distinctions within those. And that's when it goes into the next filter, which is finer. And here you're looking at principles. What should government be doing? And more importantly, well, just as importantly, what will happen if we actually pass this? And that's where you start to get into, if your solution is to tax more, you're going to make the situation worse. If your solution is to try to squeeze more money out of businesses, or if budget spending is going to create a program that restricts businesses or restricts individuals from working, that's going to have a negative effect. And there are also welfare and moral negative effects you can have. And once you start looking at your principles, what governments, you have that discussion, which I'm not aware of much of that discussion happening, in actual government all as much in the past 50 years or so. But once you've got that discussion of what should government be doing, then you can start to really fine tune what should get funded and what shouldn't. And that's a way we call it the decision of the century. You can make it a good decision. And I've been saying, if we make the right decisions, Rhode Island could actually have a renaissance, because we've changed the way, it's an opportunity to change the way we do business because we've answered these important questions.
That would be nice. So Jonathan, overall, if you look at your toolkit you put forth and what you saw in Washington State, what you see in this report, rather than just making arbitrary and political decisions under the gun, how important is it for lawmakers to actually have a strategy going into these very important budget discussions?
Well, it's essential, Mike. It really is. And this priority-based concept is exactly how you need to handle it, because the other solutions are politically motivated decisions, as you've talked about. That's been done in Rhode Island and many other states for many years. Or it's the across-the-board cut approach, which I'm not personally a huge fan of, because it cuts the well-functioning and well-performing government programs just like everything else. And so that's kind of taking the machete to when you need a paring knife, and actually can go in and find the things that are kind of the needs versus wants discussion, as Justin was just explaining. And if you don't put the idea, though, that the economy is too weak to have a tax increase, and that if you don't take taxes increases off the board, the problem, as you know, Mike, is that everything is a need. And if you want to get to the needs versus wants discussion, you need to have a hard discussion over tax increases, Rhode Island's economic competitiveness, and how you salvage that for job creators and individuals going forward.
Let me stay with you a second, Jonathan, Justin, tongue twisters here. Jonathan, is it a strategy to just sit back and rely on federal bailouts?
Absolutely not. I know this is a huge surprise to you, Mike, but the federal bailout idea is falling for the very fallacy that one of the finest economists in our lifetime, Milton Friedman, always pointed out, is that the greatest myth that there's such thing as a government's free lunch, is
Right.
that we know it doesn't exist. Washington, D.C. doesn't create resources. It extracts resources from taxpayers in other states and then redistributes those dollars into states and into government programs, but it does not create wealth. And so the idea that big government's going to come in and solve the state's problems is absolutely wrong on its face. But then secondly, is what kind of restrictions and strings come out into the state and local units of government when they accept federal dollars? We know that there's a long and painful history for those of us who believe in state autonomy and federalism, for states being bought off essentially with their own taxpayers' money from Washington, D.C.,
Right.
with these strings then attached.
Not free money, is it?
Never is, unfortunately.
So, Justin, you and I have been talking about this since you started together with me. And we go back to the speakership of Gordon Fox back in whatever year, 2011 or 12. And there's this attitude in our state that lawmakers are helpless to change the trajectory of our state, and that we have to depend on the coattails of the national economy, or in this case, on what they mistakenly think might be free money coming from the government. Justin, how would you categorize this attitude we have among lawmakers in our state? How would you add to that?
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me is one of the most exciting times, and there weren't many, when I was on the budget committee in my town, Tiverton, having some authority. We had the state's investors there for telling us what they were expecting for investments. And I actually got one of them to admit on the camera, when they set pension funding rates, the discount rates, and we all know they're too high, it is part of the discussion that you can always raise taxes at the end of the day, and that's what makes your pensions a safe investment. So that's why you can count on 7% investment returns, even though you'll never get it. And I think that kind of summed up for me the attitude of government. We can always rely on the taxpayers. It's always, and the attitude in Rhode Island, as you asked me, it's always a question of how can we slip this through a tax increase here, a tax increase there, a guilt trip here. We'll have to end education here. We'll have to put children in slave camps if we don't get this money. That's really trying to find the way to piece together the status quo and not have to make any actual difficult decisions. That's really what's characterized Rhode Island budgeting as long as I've been paying attention.
And also, Mike, on that point, on the kind of ways of hiding the cost of spending, the federal bailout just epitomizes that. Is if you are a high spending, high tax state, and you think you can socialize your costs of high taxing and high
Yeah.
spending at the state level and to taxpayers in other states that have been more frugal, why wouldn't you take that, gambit? And that's why we see Illinois and New York and other high tax states, and probably those in Rhode Island, lobbying the federal government for this bailout. And that's why you don't see lawmakers in Texas and Florida and other states that have actually kept taxes and spending in check going down that same route.
Yeah, and I'm sure
we did.
citizens in Oklahoma aren't too thrilled about paying to bail out our Rhode Island, right?
Right. Well, and we did get a taste of why that is an actual. I mean, until really the administration of the current president, we didn't really have a taste of what it might look like if the well-run states started saying we're not going to keep paying for the poorly run states, when they started to put limits on your deduction for state and local taxes. That's going to hit the states that rely on that kind of that margin to increase taxes on their own people because they know they'll get it back from the federal government. That can happen, and it can happen very quickly when the federal government says, hey, we're out of money too, and half the states plus one say, yeah, we're with you, we're not going to subsidize bad decisions anymore. And this might be a crisis that really brings that to the forefront.
I hope so. So the decision of the century is not just about the long-term, like we framed earlier, the long-term trajectory of our state and our overall business climate, which, by the way, is among the worst, and in some cases, the worst business climate in the entire nation. But it's also going to determine what kind of trajectory we have, what shape recovery we're going to have. So let's bring up that table of the recovery paths. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but I'll have Justin just shape it. But they're basically, and Jonathan, we'll have you take a national look at this in a second. But basically, economists have said there's three potential recovery shapes for the nation and for each state. We could have a V-shaped recovery where it goes up as fast as it went down. We could have kind of a U-shaped recovery where it kind of troughs out and slowly builds itself back up. Or we could have an L-shaped recovery where just for a prolonged period of time, there isn't much of a recovery. And we would say that if you taxed, started adding new taxes, that would push us towards an L-shaped recovery. So Justin, why don't you just quickly go through this table and show from a revenue point of view, what's at stake and how much is at stake depending on what kind of near-term recovery our state has.
Sure. Well, as you say, I mean, you start with the idea of different recoveries in the assumption that they're exogenous factors. The outside, this is just what's going to happen with the economy. So when the COVID-19 things first started, there was reason to think, okay, we'll just bounce right back because all the fundamentals of the economy are the same. So we'll get a V-shaped recovery because what went away will come right back. That's looking, we've been out of business for so long, that's looking less and less likely. So you start to think about a U-shaped recovery, which the co-author Dennis Sheehan says is what Rhode Island had from the Great Recession. I kind of wonder because it's a pretty wide U because we still hadn't completely recovered. So that's when you start to really more of a hit over the next couple budgets. So we were talking $500 million to $1 billion there in lost revenue to the state. And then there's the idea that something has really fundamentally changed. And in a place like Rhode Island and other blue states, that could really be that people who are having to start over, they had to shut down, now they have to start over, might say, I'm going to go somewhere else and use my productive labor and my business investment to start where I'll get more return on that investment and go to a red state like the ALEC report, blue state, red state. And then you get an L-shaped recession, which for all intents and purposes in a midterm and even somewhat longer term future, your economy has just adjusted downward to a lower level. And that can happen just as
normal.
Yeah, the new normal. And that can happen. I mean, you have to plan for that to some extent as a government budgeter. But I think the point you're raising here is the government's decisions will also affect which of those you should have. So for example, if the state of Rhode Island said, you know what, we're done being the tax and regulatory hell of the United States with the 50th business environment every year on multiple years, we're done with that, we're going to be welcoming. You could turn your L shape into a V because everybody will flow to you to start their businesses.
That's the point I want to have Jonathan pick up here is that's the thing from public comments from our political leaders, our governor, our speaker, while they may or may not be, saying we're going to tax or not tax, they don't seem to understand that the decisions they make will affect this trajectory. And will we have a smaller budget deficit like under a V-shaped recovery, or will we have that larger one you're seeing on the lower right? When you add up the rest of this year and next year, if we slow down and have an L-shaped, Jonathan, I mean, lawmakers are not helpless. The decisions they make are vital, right? Aren't they, to determining what kind of recovery their state has?
Well, absolutely. And first point there, Mike, is their determination on how quickly they can reopen their communities and their economy, and how much, just as someone who lies in a hospital bed too long has muscle atrophy, it's the same effect with the economy. It's the longer it's shut down, and if it's a government forced shutdown, it's going to have more damage, as Justin was outlining. And I think, you have to look at a couple different things here on how quickly we rebound. Is consumer confidence, as well as kind of producer and business confidence, in that they can reopen and have their workforce come back. But also at some point, it's going to be led by the private sector. It's not going to be some bureaucrat at the Department of HHS in Washington flipping a switch and telling people it's safe to get on airplanes or to go into hotels. It's going to be led by private sector companies going out of their way to say, here are the health protections that we're going to put in place to make you feel confident to go on a bus or on a train or on an airplane again and travel. And just on the kind of the consumer
and new
confidence
taxes,
side,
our new taxes aren't going to exactly do a lot for consumer confidence, is it?
well, absolutely not. I mean, it makes that all that more difficult. But then on the business confidence side, this is going to be, I think, key in that will mom and pop businesses, we've seen the big retail, a lot of the bankruptcies, and what that's going to do to commercial real estate, I think is going to be a big, big factor. But the thing that keeps me up at night is kind of what happens to the small businesses, the mom and pops, the NFIB members out there. These are people that had these businesses in their family, in some cases for generations. I mean, do they reopen their doors? And if so, can they get their employees back? Given that the federal government now, with its $600 a week extra unemployment benefits, are giving people, in many cases, a huge incentive not to go back into the workforce as an employee. And then the other thing is the liability issue. That is something that's been talked about federally. It's been talked about a lot in the states. We've seen 7 or 8 states now already move towards providing liability protection against litigious actions and frivolous lawsuits. I mean, we're not looking to protect bad actors here, clearly with negligence, but
we actually
that is a key thing to reopen businesses.
General Assembly, we might get there. But John, that brings up a good point. In fact, we could be suffering from a triple whammy here. First of all, we had the shutdowns forced by the government, extended beyond where they needed to be, and still being extended. We've shut down our governor, just so you know, so you can brag about our great state when you talk to other groups like ours. Our governor has already shut down weddings, parades, fireworks for the whole summer. She already shut it down, even though we're way down on the backside of the curve. So first you have the shutdown. Now we have businesses being looted during the riots. With the death of Mr. Blank in the name. In Minnesota. We've had riots here, businesses burned down. So now they're under threat and they're being shut down now because of that. And now they could be faced, if a worker comes back and catches the virus, they could potentially sue their employer for not having a safe environment. I mean, that's a scary triple whammy for businesses, isn't it, Jonathan?
Well, it certainly is, and certainly our hearts go out and prayers go out to the families affected, and just kind of, I think there's going to be a lot of states that address this issue probably as they come back into session when it comes to kind of police violence and kind of this the whole situation of what's gone on there. And there'll be, I think, a lot of policing reforms probably coming ahead on that. But when it comes to the economy picture, I think it's a big issue in terms of many of the businesses that have been shut down are now struggling to have the confidence to reopen, try to get their workforce back, and then try to navigate how to protect from these lawsuits that could be out there. I mean, that is really a toxic combination when it comes to businesses reopening, when it comes to the economic policy space.
Final topic. Oh, go ahead, Justin. Go ahead.
When you add in taxes there, I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. So every dollar in taxes is the dollar the business can't invest trying to make it safe for customers, plexiglass or whatever, giving employees a little bit of a pay boost so that they're willing to come back, and paying for insurance to cover them if they are sued. I mean, when you take the money away in taxes, you're just making it even harder for them to do those things.
So beyond the budget decisions that lawmakers will make, again, one of my frustrations with not having our General Assembly be absentee, sitting at home. We know, Jonathan, and you'll talk about this in just a second. We know there are other states who are finding ways to meet in person or virtually, who are passing legislation to make it easier for businesses to recover and get back on their feet. Maybe removing some issues. So our center has put out 3 different sets of 10 recommendations of policies we can enact that would help make things easier. So I'll have Justin talk about just maybe your favorite 2 or 3 there, Justin, and then we'll have Jonathan talk about what he's seeing in other states. So Justin, what do you beyond the budget, what are some things you're recommending that our state lawmakers can do?
Well, we really run the gamut on, basically we looked at all what we're talking about, reducing regulations and taxes, anywhere businesses can do those sorts of things, improving unemployment insurance. That's really the thrust of it. And I haven't actually looked at it today, so I don't have the top of mind. But it's really, people to rifreedom.org and
But they're
look
not
at it.
helpless, right? There are things.
Right, exactly. There are,
do.
and that's exactly it. And those all go in the budget priorities. I mean, they're not part of the budget per se, but there are things in government regulation and action that they should change anyway, and they're not hard to find. In fact, some of them the governor even stumbled upon, increasing the access to telemedicine and stuff like that. These are all things you can do to help people, help businesses, help everybody, the economy and the government. And we just haven't done them because of a political kind of sclerosis in our state.
Jonathan, how important are these non-budgetary, regulatory, and other kind of reforms to helping states get back on their feet? And can you give us some of your favorite examples that you're seeing in other states?
Well, and this is big. It's a huge issue that our entire policy team at ALEC has looked into. We have a new model policy on the liability issue, by the way, that we're going to be updating this document with. But at the top of the ALEC.org website, we have our 30 policy prescriptions across all kinds of areas. And we took a little bit of an outside the box way of looking at it, Mike, in that, as you know, the natural inclination of elected officials and government is to grow in times of crises, and ours was to follow the Reagan adage, as he told one of his economists during one of the crises of the 80s, don't just stand there, go undo something. So we were looking at laws and regulations and complicated rules to undo, to help get people back to work, and obviously help create a better society across the board for everyone. So whether it's occupational licensing reforms to help healthcare workers go across state lines and be able to have universal recognition and practice their trade, which is just an amazing reform that we've seen many states adopt, addressing the damaging certificate of need laws that have stopped hospital beds and ventilators going in and having capacity in those areas, the liability issue, you name it. I mean, waiving regulations such as, even something at the federal level, such as Davis-Bacon, which adds, 20 or 30% to the cost of highway and school construction in a lot of places. It's a huge issue, and there's lots that can be done without passing one new law in many cases. It's just either temporarily or permanently repealing some of the most damaging regulations out there.
Well, I'd like to suggest to any lawmaker or to the public listening here that given that the General Assembly is not scheduled to be back in full anytime soon, we're already in the first, we're approaching the second week of June. The budget's got to be done by, the last week of June. There's really not much time for a lot of deliberation. So other than putting the budget together. So I'd like to suggest, let's have a rule up to see the Speaker, Senate President. Only legislation we pass will be to undo something. That's it. Don't waste time.
Here.
We don't need anything new right now. Let's just undo it and free up the private sector to grow out of this budget deficit, this economic suppression we're in. I don't even call it a depression. I think it's a suppression. It was done purposely by government. How's that for an idea, Justin? Maybe we should get a resolution out there that only undoing things. We'll go look up Reagan's term. What do you think of that idea?
I like it. We got a petition going, and I think at the top of it, the heart of it is really who serves whom. And as Jonathan was saying, it's who do you protect? Is it we protecting the government's pocketbook or are we protecting the public? Whose regulations are we protecting? And you free up. That's the instinct, and we're seeing it to some extent in the current administration. Let's kill some regulations. We need people to be able to work again. It's kind of our first instinct, and it ought to be more widely held.
All right, Jonathan, we're going to give you the final word here. Just tell any lawmakers who are listening, others that, let them know what you know about what other states in general are doing, that they can do things to help the state and they need to get back in the saddle and help out. Final word to you, Jonathan.
Well, I tell you what, it's states across the board are looking at ways to tighten their belt and live within their means, just like individuals and businesses are having to do with some big downturns in their income. Government shouldn't be exempt from that. I mean, we posted a piece talking about North Carolina, one of the states that has really done very well. They've cut taxes. They've seen huge revenue increases and seen the Laffer curve in real life in recent years. They stocked away a big rainy day fund. Their unemployment insurance fund has tons of money there that are able to deal with this situation. And I just think, Mike, I've been through a few business cycles now watching this as a public policy person, and nothing is really new. I mean, the kind of different recessions we've seen are different, but at the end of the day, during the good times is the time that governments need to also follow priority-based budgeting and put those dollars away for a rainy day, because we don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen at some point. And so best practices like your guide and like our budget reform toolkit are absolutely essential, whether it's good times or bad. And I think it's very clear right now who followed that good advice over the last 10 years of this long economic recovery and who hasn't.
Jonathan Williams from the American Legislative Exchange Council. Thank you. Justin Katz from the Center. Thank you very much for your time. It is the decision of a century. Lawmakers have massive decisions to make. It will impact our near-term recovery and our long-term business climate and overall economic growth trajectory. We hope they've paid attention to some of the ideas put forth by our great guests today. Jonathan and Justin, thank you.
Take care, my friend.
By the way, Jonathan, congratulations on your new baby just in the past week. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. We're very proud parents.
Go Nats. Thank you,
That's
Justin.
right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
We're in the dugout. This is Mike Stenhouse. Good day.